There are very few things in the United States that have affected people more than the American war on drugs. Whether it's a family member that's an addict, a friend in jail for possession, or just an awkward encounter with a tweaker on the street, everyone has brushed shoulders with it at some point. So today, I'm going to be breaking down the war on drugs and explaining how it's been a detrimental failure of American policy as a whole. But first, in order to understand the current effects of the war on drugs, we have to take a look through history. If we go all the way back to 1914, we could get a look at what is generally deemed as the precursor to the American war on drugs. This policy is called the Harrison Narcotics Act. The Harrison Narcotics Act was originally proposed by a man named Francis Burton Harrison in 1914. The goal of the Harrison Act was to heavily regulate the importation and sale of opium and coca leaves. To be fair, regulation was needed in this historically deregulated industry, but the Harrison Narcotics Act did have some unintended consequences. It effectively stopped doctors from being able to prescribe any type of opioids as addiction treatment because addiction was not looked at as a disease back then. Now, this actually had the opposite effect and caused an illicit drug market to be formed in response. By 1965, the Harrison Narcotics Act would become an all-encompassing anti-drug act, criminalizing the use of cannabis, amphetamines, barbiturates, and hallucinogens, along with the previously mentioned opiates and cocaine. This heightened fear of drug use in the early 1900s could be attributed to figures like Harry J. Anslinger and propaganda films like Reefer Madness. Eventually, by 1971, drug policy would take its current form of the war on drugs under the Nixon administration. At this point, President Nixon formally declared war on drugs, stating it was a public health crisis. But strangely, he didn't treat it as such. Nixon instead strengthened the DEA and introduced mandatory minimum sentences. In the 80s, the Reagan administration would then put criminalization policy into overdrive, further building off of Nixon's previous iron fist drug policy. This increased enforcement is also reflective in some popular anti-drug campaigns that came out around this time, including the Just Say No campaign and DARE. Up to this point, it's been pretty clear that Reagan and Nixon's drug policy has had a heavy emphasis on criminalization and harsh sentences. But what if I told you there was a sinister second motive? The second motive is actually based on pro-war and racist rhetoric, and to show this rhetoric best, I'm going to read out a quote from one of President Nixon's top advisors, John Ehrlichman. Ehrlichman stated, "We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and the blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities." If you've been following along up to this point, then you understand that the war on drugs is pretty much about taking drugs off the street through criminalization efforts. But logically, the next question is, what do they do when they're in prison? The American prison system is in shambles, and it's a direct side effect of the war on drugs. This is because when you have a policy focused on harsh sentencing and long sentencing, then you end up having a lot of people that need to go to jail. Now, this is a major oversight made by early policymakers because the prison system has to keep growing in order to keep the system moving. This, in hand, causes the inflation of privatized prison systems. All these privatized prison systems end up being a huge problem because it takes away the goal of rehabilitation and introduces the goal of making a profit, just like any other privatized industry. This, in turn, leads to generally worse treatment of prisoners, including things like overcrowding, underfunding, and lack of rehabilitation systems. And statistics seem to back this sentiment up, with about 2/3 of all prisoners reporting some type of substance abuse problem, and the rate of inmate death via intoxication rising by 400% since the year 2000. When there's no rehabilitation program for incarcerated individuals, how do you expect them to be rehabilitated when they get out? This just furthers the cycle of drug abuse and further incarceration. With overdose deaths nearly doubling since 2015, it's easy to see that the system is not working and people are using drugs now more than ever. And this issue becomes even more frustrating once you acknowledge the fact that American taxpayers are paying roughly $85 billion a year on the American prison system and another $129 billion a year on policing. The fact that the war on drugs is costing American taxpayers roughly $214 billion a year, yet overdose rates still continue to rise every year, really tells you all you need to know about how successful the war on drugs has been. But honestly, no matter what your opinion on the war on drugs is, I hope you at least try to think about American drug policy a little bit more and try to be a little more sympathetic to the plights of addiction. Because if everyone is just complicit in a broken system, it'll eventually become impossible to make a change.